Well, part of the importance of how many Tutsi were in the country in 1994 relates back to how many people left the country in 1959 and 1960. And how many people left the country while you were going through it. There's people leaving Rwanda all the time. So what we do is, same approach that we take with the data on violence. We have different estimation possibilities of what the Tutsi population was. After there's a regime change, the Tutsi leadership that was in charge at the time flees, the Hutus take over, directly following kind of what took place in Congo. And how many people actually left at that time influences, controlling for rates of growth and so forth, influences how many people were possibly there in 1994. Take UNHCR records about people leaving and entering the country and going to others. So we have a massive kind of discounting for that as well. Our general estimation comes to 506,000. But again, we make all the material available. If you believe it's a different estimation, then you're able to calibrate that and then go through the exercise that we're going through as well. So there's different estimations of the total. And so subtracting out the number of Tutsi that survived and looking at the different range of values from the high, or from the different values that emerge. So I mentioned our median is 430. Our high is 3 million. Now, if you start thinking of how many Hutu died, then that number varies by which number you accept. The Bayes median of 430 gives us 224,000 Hutu that died. You take the plausible high end, the 614,000 figure, then we have 408 Hutu that died. That range increases depending upon which source that you accept. What this suggests, though, is once one moves from the kind of conservative estimation that we suggest, the number of Hutu that died end up dramatically outnumbering the number of Tutsi that we believe passed. Now, genocide and politicide have nothing to do with absolute number. It's about intent to kill in whole or in part. So there's nothing to detract away from the claim that a genocide or politicide took place. But this does identify that a large number of other individuals potentially died as well that need to be brought into the discussion of what took place. Further kind of impugning the issue of exactly who was killed and under what circumstances, this is information derived from the Rwandan census on exactly what's the percentage of the Tutsi by prefecture. So most of the Tutsi were located in Butare and Kibuye. You'll recall this area flashing repeatedly, so we know these people were killed, and we know that does qualify under the potentiality of being genocide or politicide or random. There's also a bunch of flashes that take place here. I'm sorry, that I didn't realize this thing was going to be in the way, but if you notice the overlay of the massive killing, this is the summary visual over here. We have massive clusters of people being killed here, 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 and up there as well. Who were those people? They don't appear to be overlaying directly with ethnicity. So what's going on? Well, this leads to the argument I'm attempting to develop is that people weren't necessarily killed for who they were killed for who they were not. You could not demonstrate your ethnicity. It was just presumed that you were other, and in that context you were killed. Now this comes down to some presumptions about the ease with which ethnic identities could be made. So there's a presumption of kind of the Hutu and the Tutsi not overlaying, that it's clear to tell them apart. There's an argument about whether or not this is the case or not, and so I actually believe there's a high variability. There's a tremendous amount of overlap, which many people identify, which is why they talk about the ID cards, which is why they talk about the identification papers, which it's not quite clear that everybody was carrying with them after the violence started. There's contending arguments about that as well. On the side, this represents all the different ways that the Belgians tried to separate the Hutu from the Tutsi. Head length, facial height, lips height, I don't know what sorry for the font, body weight, skin color, none of it worked. None of the clustering mechanisms work. Belgian phrenology is horrible. So if not ethnic difference, then politicide and genocide, political threats, the perception of threat within your particular location is what I'm arguing is driving the killing. This leads us to the importance of movement. Conventional wisdom had this as being not that important. I have this as being central. So this is one of those crazy top secret documents that I acquired at some point in time, which talks about these clusters of individuals, concentrations of displaced people in late April. They were running. They hadn't made it out yet. They were running, and this is where they clustered. Between 2 to 3 million is their estimation. You put that much of the population of 8 on the run with no clear mechanism for identifying individuals and all the reason in the world to just eliminate your enemies. Now, people forget the discussion, but there was discussion that there were massive caches of weapons that Tutsis and the Hutus that were moderate had in their possession to challenge the existing government. There's no reason to believe this wasn't true, because in 89 and 90 they were finding them. The RPF had established a radio station while they were in the north that was also talking about their brothers and those sympathizers joining them in the killing. You're then getting routed by this military force. You're willing to engage in violent activity. Well, I don't think it's just these concentrations that matter. I think everybody was fleeing. Everybody's running in large numbers. Now, this is the animation we're working on now, because how do you make estimations of population movement from commune to commune in a country where there's very little discussion of it? Well, part of what the survey that we did in Butari talked about, and also some of the interviews and focus groups, all talked about movement, all talked about people fleeing. From the 12,000 eyewitness testimony I have from ICTR, there's also a lot of statements that talk about it. When they started firing their guns, we quickly sought refuge in our room and locked ourselves in. I know that there were both Hutus and Tutsis in our midst. I hid and fled during the entire period of the events of 1994. That's why I witnessed none of the events in which the authorities allegedly participated. Like all Rwandans, I fled because I feared for my life, given at that time people were killed for no reason. The result of the policy, drafted by the high-ranking military leaders of the country, was the daily killing of Tutsis and then later Hutus, who did not agree with this policy. You must have heard of several cases of mass killing of Tutsis, such as those in Bugesera and those in Bogawi. Not far from here, in the Hutu opposition political leaders, these incidents were known by all. The records have indications of these issues, as well as people that were Tutsi hiding out with Hutu, driving in the same car with people, believing that they were of their ethnicity. Well, this gets this whole issue of, didn't people know who was who? They did locally. But again, get back to the movement of the population. Local knowledge is disrupted. These are the refugee populations outside of the country by December 1994. Again, 2 to 3 million estimation, but this doesn't include now the internal displaced numbers. These are just people that made it out of the country. Again, you'll notice this is where there was large numbers of people being killed in Kibuye that could not escape because of the huge lake. Intervention possibility. I'm almost done. I'm kind of like, Dallaire said if he had 5,000 troops, he could stop it. Intervention possibility. Where? When? Exactly where were you going to send the troops? Now, if it was 5,000 before anything happened, okay, maybe. But after it takes place, where do you send them? That discussion I haven't necessarily seen, so I wonder about this issue of the intervention possibility. Cooperman's attacks it in a different route. I'm just going off of strict logistics. You could argue that you go to the most level plane, given that that's where people might congregate, but that's also where the largest concentrations of those engaged in killing were to be located. Reconciliation possibility. If that's the distribution of the violence, that's just where people died, not where they were from initially. My question then is, where does one stop? How does one conduct reconciliation in this context when you have to reconstruct everything that we just went through and allow for the complexity of the violence? The random, the reprisal, the civil war, the genocide, the politicide. What's necessary then is a process that is open to this diversity, which it currently is not. So let me discuss a little bit about the conclusion, and then then I'm done. So genodynamics challenges most of the conventional wisdom. I find the violence highly diffuse and variable. I find a wide variety of types of killing, and I highlight interstate war, not civil war. You have troops coming from a foreign country into another country. That's interstate war, in political science at least. Now, if you're able to prompt the local population to join you, or it's indigenously started, that's the definition of civil war. So there's interstate war, there's genocide, there's politicide, there's war crimes, because there's a relationship between the violence of what the government is doing and what the challengers are doing. There's reprisal killings, there's random violence. We need to investigate all of it and parse responsibility and dynamics in that context. The identity, I step away from this ethnic identity, and I'm paying attention to political actors. It's the existing government that is a problem. It is the rebels that are a problem. Are there random actors that are the problem? I'm downplaying the ethnicity. I think it's there from the genocide and the politicide, but I'm also identifying that this is more like a totalitarian purge on the fly, being prompted to do so by someone who's about to take over their country. The number of individuals involved, I'm not quite sure. I'm not stepping there. Number of victims, mostly Hutu, some Tutsi, and some Twa. The number between 400,000 and 600,000. The importance of movement extremely high. The intervention possibility low. Reconciliation complexity, not necessity. Complexity high. What changes with the rethinking? Detection is hard to do of these events. It was not the easiest thing since the Holocaust to detect in terms of genocide. It is extremely complex to identify what took place. Intervention, act wisely, not faster, which involves having information about what is going on and this information being understood by different parties that are not highly politicized. The RPF, I hold them as accountable as everybody else for the violence, in fact, more so given the fact that I think they were driving some of it. And post-genocidal assistance, there's different forms of justice, there's different forms of activities that need to take place, but victors' justice should not go unchecked, which is what I think currently exists as the RPF tends to set the pace for everything that takes place in terms of justice in Rwanda. Insofar as peace building works, we need a broader, not a smaller, view of the violence. Currently, the violence is constructed around one form, genocide. It ignores the variety of activities that I've identified here and the implications of that variation and the nature of the relationship between them. It needs to be broader in terms of temporal considerations, the number of actors, the type of actors, the timing. We also need a broader view of post-violence. Wanted for genocide. This is setting the pace for what people are doing. Gacaca is structured extremely narrowly around the same exact point. The complexity that I've identified necessitates incorporation if we do get to a situation or have the possibility of moving to a situation of peace. As for future research, we need to deal with this migration issue. We need to understand the influence of flight and mass movement on the violent activity. We need to actually relate this radio hate argument, which people kind of keep tossing around. The number of individuals mentioned on the radio is never correlated to actually the number of people that are killed in any way, shape, or form. It might have been prevalent in one location, but not another. We need to get back to that. We need to code these freaking 12,000 ICTR testimonies. Help. I mean, we're trying all types of stuff. There's a lot of information in there. They finally released it to us. They've not allowed anybody else to have it. I don't think they want us to share it, but they gave it to us, so I'm out. I'm done. We need to compare the violence in genodynamics against violence reported in novels, films, and journalistic articles. This in part because I believe people come away from Rwanda with a sense that the modal killing was interfamilial. That father killed daughter or mother involved killing a cousin. How do you get to 800,000 people or 1 million people with that dynamic? I don't think you do. I think that's the modal survival story because you have 40,000 people dying in a stadium. the characterization of the violence needs to return back to understanding this large-scale nature of it and tracking those individuals and realizing that the discussion that we have currently is a function in part of who's left to listen to. And we need to assess the relationship between violence and post-violence, which is a science dissertation, which is good. And that was an extra slide, sorry. That's it.